everyone. Welcome to the Guatemala Life and Culture podcast. I am your host, Jeff Bray, and I'm here with my co-host, Don Hoffmeyer. Don, how you doing?
Doing well, thanks.
Awesome. So we're really excited about this podcast series. It's something that we've been wanting to do for quite a while now. And there's two goals for this series. One is to help educate our community about our Guatemalan neighbors, and we'll be talking about what life's like in Guatemala, history, how and why they come to our area, and what life is like once they're here. But the second part of it is we also want to leave a historical narrative, something that people can refer to years in the future, to where they can look back and see what life was really like when we had this wave of Guatemalan immigrants coming to our community, something that young people who were born and raised in a Guatemalan family can look back and say like, oh, I didn't realize that was what was going on when my parents first immigrated here. And so we're excited about that. And the way that this series is going to work is each episode we're going to cover a different topic. And for those of you who have seen my Guatemala Life and Culture presentation, we're going to follow a similar format to that. So for this first episode, we will be introducing ourselves as hosts, tell you a little bit about ourselves, how we got involved in the Guatemalan community and how long we've been involved. And the second part of this episode, we will be talking about culture, because culture is at the foundation of everything that we're going to be talking about. And if we don't understand what culture is, then it's going to be really difficult to understand the rest of the content for this series. For this series, we are going to take a journey together, and that journey is really founded in empathy. And one of the great things about empathy is we don't always have to agree with what someone else is doing, how they're living their life, but what we can do is put ourselves in their shoes. And that's really important for this podcast series. Is it doesn't matter your religious background, your political background. What we're providing for you is really just facts about the daily life. This is who the community is, and then you can take that and kind of come to your own conclusions. But we really just want to provide a kind of behind the curtain look at the Guatemalan community, and an important part of that is empathy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So with that empathy in mind, we'll talk about the history of Guatemala. We'll talk about where they come from in Guatemala, what life is like there, how and why they come to the United States, and what life in the United States is like.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Awesome. So with that being said, we'll get into our first episode. And in this first episode, we're simply just introducing ourselves as hosts, telling you a little bit about who we are, how we've been involved with the Guatemalan community, and why we do what we do. And then we'll finish up with talking a little bit about culture and how that, in addition to empathy, is kind of the foundation for the series, and understanding that will be very important to future episodes. So you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
You ready?
All right. So let's get going on episode 1, introductions and the foundations of culture.
Let's do it.
So to get going here, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Jeff Bray, and I've been working with the Guatemalan community for a little over 12 years now, in a bunch of different capacities. And I'm originally from Columbus, and honestly, Tuscarawas County was one of the last places I thought I would end up. But, one thing led to another, and I started working at New Philadelphia City Schools in a part-time capacity to actually raise money to move overseas. But during that time, I got to know the students, I got to know the families, and it became very apparent that all the reasons I felt called or wanted to go overseas was actually right here in this small Tuscarawas County. Yeah. And I was actually really surprised to hear that there was a large Guatemala population. And I had learned Spanish while traveling, and so coming in and getting to know those families, it became really difficult to imagine moving on when there was so much need here. just from a resource perspective and from an understanding perspective. You had this new immigrant community, or relatively new, and very little things to connect the gap between, individuals who have been here their entire lives and these new immigrants. And so over the last 12 years, like I said, in different capacities, just working with the population, and really excited that we finally get to do this podcast, because we're really going to be able to talk about lessons learned, things learned over that period of time, and even some individuals who have been doing this longer than I have. And so that's a little bit about myself. And as we go through the series, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about our experiences, but I'll pass it over to Dawn.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Well, my name is Dawn Hoffmeyer, and I have been living in the community in Tuscarawas County for about 6 years. I'm in my 6th year now, so just about halfway. I've got some catching up to do, but I grew up in Northeast Ohio, was born in Massillon. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, but it's kind of same as you. It seemed like I was destined to come back to this area, not knowing at all what the population was at the time. But long story short, after college, I traveled with a missions organization called Youth with a Mission, based in Chile. So I wanted to have an out of this country experience, but had no idea what that was going to look like. And why did I pick Chile? Well, just because the opportunity presented itself. So I had no idea that I was going to pick up Spanish while I was during my years with Youth with a Mission, but I did. And I remember the very first teaching that I saw where there was an interpreter. The teaching was in Spanish into English, and from the first moment I was just fascinated. So that was just a different experience of more of a discipleship and missions training experience that I did for several years, but I had no idea that picking up another language would come from it. And now the opportunities, the doors that has opened, I consider to have been way more of an education than any of my college years combined. So yeah, I traveled for a couple of years, and I would say that also was very foundational for understanding different cultures and seeing a world beyond Northeast Ohio, what I'd always known. And long story short, I ended up back in Dover because I have a sister who is very local, and she had always told me for years that there was a large Guatemalan population. But I really did not know what that meant. And I know we'll get into this later, but I didn't know that there were other languages in Guatemala other than Spanish. So I thought, now with my language ability, I'm in, that'll be great. And yes, it is great, but I had no idea. Just to give a little teaser, there's so much more involved to the Guatemalan culture that I did not understand at the time. So since 2018, I've been in the area between Dover and New Philly, and I have now been working with New Philly City Schools as a bilingual parapro, as well as with a local medical interpreting agency called Clear Communications. So those experiences have more than broadened my view of not only Guatemalan culture, but just Latino culture in general, living in the States. Which is very different from my overseas experience. So yeah, the past several years have been a nice integration of the two. And like you said, Jeff, a lot of things that I was looking for in future plans, like teaching English overseas or, just living somewhere else, that's very exciting. And, the adventurous spirit in you, just, if you're able to do it, you're like, why not? Let's just move, But then realizing that those opportunities are literally right here locally, that's just been, same thing. I've been kind of doing the same thing as you, realizing that I can have this very different cultural life, not just experience, but life here as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely much more exotic or exciting to think about living in, Colombia or Guatemala or
Thought you were going to say
Nicaragua.
Columbus. Yes,
Columbus,
Colombia. Yeah.
Yeah, depending on what parts, I guess.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, sometimes you realize that, small Tuscarawas County has just as much diversity out there. You just have to tap into it. And hopefully that's what this podcast will be able to do for people is open their eyes and maybe create a little more color for their, their experience in Tuscarawas County, and realize you don't have to go on a missions trip. There's a lot of things right here.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dawn. And
welcome.
So let's get into our content. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, we're going to be talking about empathy and culture, and empathy and culture being the foundations of the rest of what we'll be doing through this series. And one quote about empathy is, empathy begins with understanding life from another person's perspective. Nobody has an objective experience of reality. It's all through our own individual prisms. And that's a quote from Sterling Brown. Another quote is, it's not only moving that creates new starting points. Sometimes all it takes is a subtle shift in perspective, an opening of the mind, an intentional pause and reset, or a new route to start to see new options and new possibilities. And that's Kristen Armstrong. So empathy is a very important part of what we'll be talking about for the rest of this series. And a big thing of empathy is worldview. And worldview is essentially the way that you see the world. And that is determined by the way you grow up, the customs that you've been around. And one of the better examples I can give of this is using sports as an example. So if you're someone like you, Dawn,
what about me?
who's not a big fan of sports.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So let's say that you went into a hockey game. Have you ever been to a hockey game before?
Twice, yes, I have.
Okay.
I've seen Mighty Ducks a few times too.
Well, okay.
That's where I would be starting from.
That's a great
That's
example.
My context, yes.
Yeah, context matters.
Yes.
And sometimes media doesn't always give us the right context of
that is true.
What sports is, right? Yeah, so, think back to that first time that you walked into a hockey game, or for people that are watching or listening to this, think of a time that you went into, whether it's a sport or something else you're completely unfamiliar with. What were you feeling? There could be confusion, there could be nervousness, or, there could be some just like, what is going on? Why are these people so obsessed with this? I don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah. No understanding of what it's about.
No understanding, because you don't have that worldview. For someone like myself, I've grown up in sports. I've been a diehard fan of, hockey, baseball, college football. So when I walk into an arena or a stadium, I get those feelings. It's not just about the people playing the game. It's about those connections to going with your dad, to going with friends, to these sporting events. It becomes so much more than a win or lose. It's almost like a piece of yourself is out there, which sounds probably ridiculous to people who aren't sports fans.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, you don't get it, right?
Right.
So it's the same thing when we're talking about immigrant communities. Their worldview is different. It's not that it's right or wrong, but when we look at an immigrant community and their customs from the outside, we could be questioning it, confused by it, intimidated, maybe a bit fearful at times, because we just don't understand it. And it's the same thing from their perspective. They're moving into a new area, and they might have the desire to be a part of the community, to learn our customs in this area. But how do you start to do that?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So when you go into that hockey game for the first time, if you're going in on your own, you're observing a lot of things, but you're not really going to be able to fully understand unless someone is there with you to say, this is what icing is.
Yeah.
This is why these people are upset about this.
Absolutely.
Right?
Oh, makes me want to go to a hockey game now.
Good. Yeah. So the great thing about that is it can be learned, and worldviews can change. It just takes experience. It takes someone being able to walk alongside you and say, hey, this is the way that this operates in this aspect of life, right? So there's another quote by Levison Wood. He says, there is a reason behind everything. And to imagine that we know it without asking questions is foolhardy at best and jingoistic at worst. Jingoistic means basically you're passionate to the point of war. You're so into it that you want to defend it at all costs. So he continues, put aside ego, both personal and national, and ask why. Then ask again, because the first answer is rarely the correct one. And I love that quote because it really tells us the complexity of life and culture, that you can't just watch Mighty Ducks and say, oh yeah, I know hockey. Because you really don't.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It takes time. It takes asking questions over and over again to really understand where a person is coming from. So as we move forward through this podcast and we talk about, the different things we'll be discussing, keep asking questions.
Yes.
And you don't have to take our word for it either. Do your own research, go out, interact with the community, and experience for that self, because there's always going to be another layer that you can pull off and learn.
Absolutely.
So with that, we come to our first big, really lesson, I guess, or piece of information that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. And that is, what is the difference between Latino and Hispanic? So we might hear, say, the Hispanic community, the Latino community, and there is a difference.
There is.
But if you interchange these terms, no one's going to be upset. It's not like a horrible thing that people are going to be offended by.
Not an offense, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Hispanic is Spanish-speaking people from Spanish-speaking countries. So they would be individuals that descended from Spain. And Hispanic refers basically to the language spoken. Latino, on the other hand, is people from the geographic area of Latin America. That includes Central America, South America, the Caribbean. And that focuses more on geography. And why that's important for us is when we talk about the Guatemalan community, they are Latino.
Yes.
And as you kind of referenced in your intro, yes, Guatemalans can speak Spanish, but that isn't necessarily their native language. And so for that reason, they're, as we'll discuss, they're indigenous Mayan Indians with their own language. So referring to them as Latino is what we'll do in this podcast, and what we would encourage anybody who's discussing the Guatemalan community, because it certainly is more inclusive of the population that we have.
Okay, so just so I understand, because this has always been sort of an interchangeable terminology for myself as well. Like when people ask, are they Hispanic or are they Latino? Well, both at the same time. So what we're saying is that basically Spain is the only geographical country that is not considered Latino because it's not part of Latin America, correct?
Correct.
But language-wise, Hispanic, because the language is Spain. And that's usually where I think culturally, that's our understanding of how we learn Spanish in the public school setting. Basically, primarily it comes from the Spanish, not Latin American Spanish, correct?
Correct. Absolutely. So it's basically it groups based off of, culture as opposed to skin color, race, or the physical features of a group of people.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Awesome. So we also said that culture, in addition to empathy, is the foundation of what we're talking about. And the definition of culture is an integrated pattern of human behavior that includes thoughts, communication styles, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions. So that's a big, long definition to say culture really is everything about who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that if you're watching this on YouTube,
yes,
we have visuals that we will be referring to. If you're listening to this in your car or at home, you can follow the link in the description of the episode. And if you would like to see what we're referring to, we encourage you to click on that link and be able to check that out. So on the screen right now, we have a photo of a little girl, and she's wearing the traditional clothing of a Guatemalan female. And she has the hair wrap. And even though I speak Spanish, and even though I've been around the Guatemalan community for quite a while, I still don't know that I can pronounce that correctly. So
it's probably not a normal part of your
so I'm not even going to
vocabulary.
attempt to try it, but there is a hair wrap on the top of the girl's head that's very colorful. And then there's the huipil, or the blouse, that is also very colorful. Then you have a faja, or a belt. And then you have the corte, which is the skirt. And for those of you in the community, if you're ever out driving around, walking around, I can almost guarantee that you've seen a woman or a small child that is wearing this customary clothing. And Don, do you want to tell us a little bit about the corte and how you can actually tell where in Guatemala a person's from based off of the design or the color of their corte?
And I just want to say I'm such an expert because I've actually donned a corte once in my life when I visited Guatemala.
I can happily say that I haven't.
I'm glad you haven't. Yes. And also the belt. So to describe the corte, it wraps around. It's a pretty thick skirt that wraps around, your waist and covers all your legs. And then the belt goes over top to hold it in place. So not like a loop around through any loops belt like we would think of. So it's all very secure. And the pattern of the corte or the skirt is what gives away where someone is from, or tells where a woman would be from what village or what area of Guatemala, what department. So, and I'm familiar with the ones that I've visited, Neba, Quiche. So, that would just tell you a little bit geographically where someone is from. And if you really know, if you've studied the patterns, which I have not, maybe you would be able to say, oh, she probably speaks this indigenous language as well. Absolutely. So it's just the design, the pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the little girl in this photo, she's wearing a corte that would be from the Neba area,
Correct.
It's mainly red with some patterned striping. So if you're out and about and you see that, the woman is more than likely, not always, but more than likely from the Neba area of Guatemala and speaks the language of Ixil, in addition to possibly Spanish. Mm-hmm. And then if you see a more kind of a busy patterned corte, probably from the region of Quiche or Chesh, and might speak the language of Quiche.
Yes.
So we'll get more into that in a future episode, but we briefly talk about that because it looks different. It looks foreign. And Definitely. If you're walking through Tuscarora Park or Dover Park and you see a female wearing one of those, it's like, oh, that's different. Mm-hmm. And I would actually encourage people, it's okay to go up and ask.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's interesting. What do you call that? Or what part of Guatemala are you from? And
absolutely. And it's not something I would like to add, like it's because someone living in the community dresses traditionally doesn't mean that they're quote unquote new to the community and haven't adapted to American dress per se. Like it's very much still a normal part of their culture to dress, even if you don't need to be distinguished from different villages. But yeah, it doesn't really mean that someone is new to the area. It just means that they prefer to still keep their traditional dress.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, one of the common times that you might see them wearing that would be on a Saturday or a Sunday or for church. Yes. So, in our American tradition, you, in the traditional sense, you dress up in a suit and tie if you're a male, or maybe a dress if you're a female. And so the Guatemalan might dress in normal jeans and a t-shirt
Absolutely.
For most of their day. But then if it comes time for a ceremony or an event, they might don the traditional clothing as well.
Yeah.
listeners also might be wondering, okay, so that's the female version of dress. What about the men? And quite honestly, there is a traditional way that men dress, and you will see that in Guatemala, but you don't really see that in our area. And I don't really know why.
Yeah.
But if you were in Guatemala, you might see the cowboy hat, the slacks or the jeans with some sort of cowboy boot-like shoe with just a normal shirt. But
I would say I've seen more in Guatemala when I visited the shirt or blouse that gentlemen wear that has like not a tassel, but yeah, it's a different
kind of a Western style.
It is kind of Western, yeah. That I've seen more often in Guatemala than I see here. You're right; it's more of just a button-up shirt. Yeah.
And going off of, the traditional way in America that we would have dressed for church is you will see a lot of the men and boys wearing a suit.
Yes.
To church still dressing up for things like that. So as we continue to talk about culture here, a lot of the culture that you'll see in an individual, and Don kind of touched on this, just because they're wearing the traditional clothing or you hear them speaking an indigenous language or Spanish, it doesn't mean that they don't know English.
Correct.
It doesn't mean that they haven't been in the United States for a while. But based off of the amount of time that someone's been in Ohio and Tuscarawas County is going to depend on how acculturated they are, how used to our customs they are. And the other thing about culture is there's things that we see, we hear, we feel. That's food, music, dress, as we've talked about, language, certain festivals that they partake in. Those are things that we can see about culture. But there's a lot of things about culture that we can't see, and that's under the surface. And that could be what they value, religious beliefs, views on how you raise kids, leadership styles, how you view yourself, and numerous other things.
Oh, yeah.
And those are the things that we hope to unpack in this podcast series to kind of go beneath the surface and go beyond what you see and hear on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So a few of those things that we'll touch on now is Guatemalans typically have a greater respect for authority and they kind of know, for lack of a better term, one's place. And so again, when we talk about these things, it doesn't mean every Guatemalan that you see is going to fit into this. Just like every person from Tuscarawas County, you can't pin down into a box.
Yeah.
So let's keep that in mind. But generally speaking, there's a lot of Guatemalans that do have that respect for authority. And I don't know if you can kind of explain from your experiences, Don, what that looks like for them.
Yeah, so in my experience in the educational as well as medical field, because I work as an interpreter in both, I definitely see this. I wouldn't have been able to describe it beforehand, but it makes perfect sense now that, say, I'm with a patient in triage and then in the ER, with a sick child that has a fever, something pretty common. I think that the way the respect is often shown for the doctors is that the parents might speak less or not know what to say to give the healthcare providers information on why their child, like when the symptoms started. And obviously that's their job, is the healthcare providers ask all of the questions, to get those answers repeatedly. But so I think that a way that I've seen Guatemalans, parents in particular, show respect is they won't offer anything unless the doctor thinks it's necessary to ask. And
because they're the expert.
Because they're the doctor's the expert. On the opposite, I know that, seeing an American parent or family come in kind of demanding this, I know that this is what's wrong with my child because I've, of this and this and this, and they're more so telling the healthcare professionals, and that's not really out of disrespect. It doesn't have to be. It's just a more informed, this is what I know, so help me with what I don't know. But I think more the silence of someone who understands less of how that works culturally in the healthcare system. That's the attitude, is they're saying, well, you're the doctor, you're the nurse. Like, who am I to tell you? And then when presented with maybe different options for care, the response will most often be, well, whatever you think is best. I'll go with your expert advice.
Yeah. And I think we see that in the schools as well.
Yes.
For a parent-teacher conference, the parents do care deeply, for the education of their child. But from the outside, it might seem like they don't, because maybe they don't ask as many questions as an Anglo or an American parent. And again, it goes back to worldview of, have they ever been in a situation where you come into a school and you get to sit down with the teacher and have a discussion about your kid's education?
Yes.
They might not have ever done that before. And so when a teacher asks, what do you think? Just like you were saying with the medical personnel, they might be like, I don't know. I mean, you're the teacher. Like, you tell me what I should be doing.
Yes. Or for example, I would think in that setting, in different meetings, whether they're teacher conferences, IEP meetings, where you're going more in depth into the overall, like, child as a whole, not just in education, not just at home, but asking parents things like, what are some weaknesses? Maybe what are some areas of growth? What are some strengths that your student has? If you've never been asked that question before, you might say, well, they're really nice, or they put away the dishes when I ask them to, which is a strength. And then you're like, okay, yeah, let's keep going with that. And then oftentimes, the overall respect is shown in the way they hold their children to respect. The question that I always hear in parent-teacher conferences at the end of everything is, any other questions? Well, how are they behaving in class? Are they respectful to the teacher? Do they fight with other students? That the overall behavior, just that's more outwardly. Are they respectful? Because respect is such an important value culturally.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about this in the education episode, but a lot of the parents also might not have ever gone to school. So when a teacher asks, what are your child's strengths? They don't really know what to look for in their kid, because maybe they're not able to help their child in the way other parents might be able to. So there is a lot more of an emphasis on how they behave, how they interact. But we'll talk about that in a future episode. A couple of the other things regarding culture is relationships are more important than efficiency. And so it's kind of the old saying, slow is fast. So whether you're law enforcement, medical personnel, teacher, or just someone who would like to get to know a family, you really have to take time to build the trust, to build the relationship before you can get a true sense of, where the family's coming from. And obviously there's certain circumstances where you don't have time to build that relationship, and that's understandable. But whenever there's a rush to get information, it might be a little more difficult to get that information from the family, because they're like, wait, who am I talking to? What do they do? What's this all about? And they can be a little overwhelmed, because culturally, again, their worldview, they're used to kind of a slower pace for things. Yeah.
I heard this described, or I was given a description just in my first weeks, probably in Chile, that for the Latino versus American work ethic as Americans, or westernized, like Europeans, whatever, culture, that we do value efficiency. So it's more independent and individualized. My mentality going into my workday or project is, I need to focus. This is, relationships are over here, but right now the priority is to work. And on the opposite, in a more Latino culture, or the value for work ethic is let's do this together, and we work better together. And it's more important that I listen to how your family is doing as we're working than saying, that's for later, or that's a separate category of work. They kind of mesh together where you're still valuing the individual, but also focused on, well, you kind of do it at the same time. And we could argue there's pros and cons to being solely focused on getting the job done and also interacting at the same time. But
yeah, and I think that kind of slides into our next point of, culturally speaking, it's not so much future oriented or future focused. It's day to day.
Present. Yeah.
So going along with the efficiency, it's okay. So something might start at 4:00. And for us Westerners, we're like, yeah, I need to be there at 3:45 to make sure that I'm on time.
Yeah.
But in the Latino culture, in the Guatemalan culture, something might start at 4, but it really might not start until 5. And
correct.
I remember I was in Guatemala on one of my trips, and I came across this meme, and it was this guy. It was a cartoon, but it was this guy sitting in the middle of all these empty chairs, saying that I'm here for the party, and it was just like, that's what it's like to show up on time at a Guatemalan party. You're going to be the only one there.
Yes.
And you're going to sit there for a while.
Yet. Yeah.
It has not started yet. So that just kind of goes into the relationships and into how they've operated in the past. And so that's why also in our society, we're so focused on calendars and setting up appointments for months in the future. Our Guatemalan population just isn't used to that. They don't do that in the aldeas or villages where they come from. So whether you're the school and you say, hey, 2 months from now, we're going to have this field trip, or, your kid's appointment is going to be May 3rd and it's only February. More than likely, they're not going to remember that appointment.
Right.
Or for a myriad of other reasons. I've given this example too. Family is very important.
Yes.
Family is more important than the individual. So even though parents agree that education is very important, let's say you're a middle schooler and you have a guitar concert or a choir concert, and it's for a grade. Say it's worth 100 points. Yeah. And you go home and your parents have to go to work, or they have to go, get the groceries. And because they didn't have that on the calendar, they didn't schedule around that. So now that middle schooler is caught in between of, my parents want me to stay home while they do this task for the family and watch my younger siblings. But the school is also expecting me to be at this choir concert. So either way you look at it, that student's kind of at a crossroads of, oh man, if I do this, my parents will be mad or disappointed. Or if I do this, the school's going to be like, where were you?
Right.
So that's just where culture can kind of get in the way, where, if you're not scheduling things and just that focus on the present and on the family over the individual's needs.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes it is more efficient to send out a reminder or a call about a meeting just a few days before instead of a month ahead, because culturally as well, like we always send out reminders when the date comes closer. So it's almost just like there's no need for the broad, hey, this is going to happen in the future. It's just, when is it happening? A couple of days beforehand is just to some people that would stress them out, because you need to have your calendar planned.
Yeah. I have things on my Google Calendar for next year already. Yeah, so I'm all about that, but yeah. And so I think that's just important to remember. It's okay to send those reminders out early, but if you're in a profession where you're working with the Guatemalan population, just maybe take the extra little bit of effort to send that reminder phone call. And as we'll talk about when we talk about language and education, verbal reminders and communication is the best way to go.
Absolutely.
But stay tuned for a future episode to learn more about that. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first episode. We really thank everyone for taking the time to listen. And so we've laid that foundation for empathy, talked about culture. And so our next episode, we're going to talk specifically about where are they from? Where are the Guatemalans from? Not just, we know they're from Guatemala,
right,
but where in Guatemala are they from? And talk about what life is like in the aldeas, which is another word for village, and their towns. And so that's our next step in this journey of empathy, of really immersing ourselves into what is life like there, so that we can start to see a little bit of their worldview to provide context. So again, we thank you for joining us on this episode, and we hope you join us for episode 2.